Hello, I'm Alex Tock, the director of the Tommy Thompson Center on Public Leadership. And the Thompson Center is delighted to be able to bring you today's event on polling in a polarized world, the promises and pitfalls of public opinion surveys in 2024. We have an amazing lineup of panelists today to talk about polling. But before I do that, let me very briefly introduce the Thompson Center for those who are unfamiliar. The Thompson Center was founded to follow in the footsteps of Governor Tommy Thompson, who proudly worked with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to advance the public good. To follow in Governor Thompson's footsteps, the Thompson Center works to strengthen effective public leadership in Wisconsin through events such as this one and across the UW system, as well as scholarships, research grants, and speaker grants. So, without further ado, let's introduce today's panelists. All right. So I will start with Blake Reynolds. Blake Reynolds is the Chief Technology Officer at Murphy Nassika and Associates. Chris Perkins is a partner at Ragnar Research Partners. Stefan Hankin is the founder and president of Lincoln Park Strategies. Pete Brodnitz is founder and president of Expedition Strategies. And Michael Baselice is president and CEO of Baselice and Associates. So let's just start with a general question of how reliable is public opinion research for going into the 2024 election. That is, how well can we predict who's going to win the election with our surveys?
Well, who wants to start first?
Let's go first.
Reliability and predictability are two different things.
Right.
Let's just jump back to 2016 and say, I was on C-SPAN, and so you can find this recording out there probably somewhere, looking at the 2016 publicly available data. And there was only 2 states that were outside the margin of error from the public opinion research that was available for us all to see. It was Ohio and Iowa. The rest of the states were inside the margin of error, but the media was down a path of a high percentage chance that Hillary Clinton would win. And the story that came out of 2016 was public opinion research was off the mark, but it was on the mark. And so we ought to set that straight right now, that the public opinion research that was out there was decent. It was within the margin. Now, we're all private pollsters, so our private polling will stand up to the public polling because we're a little bit more into the details of the sample design, and we don't take, for example, surveys of adults in Wisconsin and then look at voters down from that. But a lot of media polls will start out with adults and scale down to voters, and then scale down to even smaller groups of likely voters. So we're comparing green apples and red apples many times, but by and large, the publicly available data is decent.
Yeah. And I think.
Go ahead, Stefan.
The one thing that we tend to tell, I'll say, folks, and again, not our direct clients, because as Mike said, we're typically dealing with internal polling and information, and that's a different animal. But if you're looking at the publicly available data, right, that don't worry quite as much about, is it 48, is it 46, is it 42? Like, just if there's a series of surveys that have been released, look at it, and if it's, using Wisconsin as an example, right? If 4 of the last 4 surveys have Biden up by X points, right? Biden's probably up by a little bit right now. If every survey has Trump up, then Trump's probably up a little bit. And if it's a mix, then, it's in the toss-up. I mean, it's a state that we know is going to be close, so it's probably going to be a toss-up regardless of what you really hear out there. But so sort of looking for the larger, what's the general trend that we tend to see across. And then, also just with the caveat of, whatever you're hearing now is not predictive of November, right? This is what you see now is what's happening now. And that could be totally different 4 or 5 months from now.
And just echoing what Mike was saying just a second ago, I mean, there is a difference between, what we do as private pollsters and the way public pollsters conduct their methodology. From a public point of view, the media has a story to tell. So there is a poll that was public and they want to tell a story and write a story and promote a story based on what the results are saying. We don't do that. We have clients that we have to give them strategic advice on, and I think that's the big difference between as a general reader and consumer of news versus what we have to do on the client. I mean, I always say don't make strategic decisions on polls you didn't pay for. So in the public side, it's just a little bit different. I mean, I could say this kind of speaking for all of us. We do survey research off a voter file for voter surveys, not out of a phone book. So there is a difference between kind of what we're doing on the private side and in the public side. So to answer that, Alex, to answer your question, I mean, yes, it is more difficult to get completes per se, but it's not difficult to get accurate, polling information if you're doing it right. So.
Yeah, so I want to follow up on that. There's been at least some discussion about response rates being lower than in the past. So beyond the sort of just sampling error, how much of a challenge is low response rates or particularly biased responses, say shy Trump voters, that sort of concept? Are those real challenges, and how well can we address them?
Since I teed it up, I'll go first and then let the other gentleman talk. Yes, I mean, to answer your question, yes, it is more challenging. Response rates are lower. The cell phone only household percentage just continues to shoot up. I mean, there are very few surveys I conduct that has even higher than 20% landlines, regardless of the state nowadays. So response rates are lower. There's a couple of ways to do that. Number one is just, we always use the term dial harder. I'm kidding. But there is more people hours and agent hours that have to go into completing, a survey. If it's a statewide in Wisconsin, to get 800 interviews just takes a lot more people. And then there's others. I'll let some of the others deal in other methodological ways. There's text to web. There are other ways to be able to complete to complete surveys. But a lot of it, I mean, is really just managing kind of your data centers or your phone centers or your agents. You just need more of them to be able to continue to get the completes. I'll let others talk about that too.
So as far as the shy voter issue, I think that wasn't a real issue. And it looks like it's less so these days because the issue was with people, I believe, feeling like it was socially unacceptable to admit you were voting for Trump. But these days, with so many polls that show that Trump is tied or leading Biden, I don't think that's so much of a factor. So, because that's one aspect of the shy voter issue is people who you get on the phone or you get in the survey one way or another, but then they don't want to tell you who they're going to support. The other issue is just making sure your sample represents everybody. And so then you might particularly have an issue in, say, rural areas also where you just have trouble getting the right people. And that, again, goes to the difference between the internal polls and the external polls, because anyone who does an internal poll is afraid of that. The way things work with polling these days is you could do brilliant work But ultimately, the question everybody asks is, were you accurate or not? It doesn't matter if you were strategically, profound. Did you get it right or not? So anyone who does this and provides it to people and gets paid to do it is going to be very careful of making sure that the sample represents the entire electorate. And then you have to just make sure that you're spending the extra effort to look at the voter file and look at what your expectations are for where the votes are going to come from, and to make sure that your sample is representative. You can do that, but I always think of it that I've never actually seen one, but I'd love to see a chart that graphs the cost of televisions and the cost of polls, to conduct, because it would be an X. I mean, it's one of the few things in life where the cost just does shoot up, because we've got to try these multimodal ways of reaching people, and the calling piece of it does get more expensive. The good news is that I don't know how it works on the Republican side, but I think it's the same thing, which is there's a lot of good modeling information that you can use on the file in order to also help with your quality control. And that's a lot of it.
Low response rates aren't really a problem. They're not a challenge because we get low response rates. They happen naturally. All right. So when I started in this business 35 years ago with a firm that did Governor Thompson's work in Wisconsin while he was in office, I remember working out at the phone center and in Houston. And my first week on the job was April of 1989. And there was 167 phones in this company at the time. And the person in charge of the phone center on a day-to-day operational basis was very concerned that we were moving from 1.5 refusals for every completed interview to 2 refusals for every completed interview. At the time, we had about 14 or 15 total dials to get it complete. Now we have 12, 13, 14 refusals for every complete, and it can be well over 200 dials to get one completed interview. So how does any of this work? We are fortunate, by and large, that those who answer a survey collectively are representative of the electorate. But we have to do things we didn't have to do 30 years ago. We look over the nights of calling and say, oh, guess what? We're ahead with Hispanic voters in this region. Don't dial any more voters with Spanish surnames on the last night. I likened it to an old computer game we had where you could land the lunar module and all 4 legs of the lunar module had to hit the moon surface at the same time at a certain speed, or else you would have a crash. We have to do that now with dialing. We have to monitor what's happening over the evenings of calling to not get too far and too ahead or behind with a certain set of subgroups. The main ones being partisanship, age, gender, and race, ethnicity within a regional basis. And so things have changed a little bit along those regards. A lot more, like Chris says, a lot more hours, a lot more work goes into getting a representative sample. But we can still get them, and we do.
And I think, and this kind of goes to the whole, like, are you dealing with a poll that was conducted by a professional or by whoever had the lowest price? And, so your larger public polling disseminators, right? So your New York Times, your Wall Street Journal, like ABC News, things like, they are paying a professional to do this job, and more often than not, they're going to have good research that they're disseminating. When it's like Joe's TV channel, and we use this researcher no one's ever heard of and probably paid like $5 for it, it's going to be probably more likely than not garbage, because as Mike was pointing out, everyone's pointing out, right? It can be done. It can be done well. It can be done accurately. It takes time. It takes effort, and it takes a lot more people dialing phones and more time. And if you do it correctly, if you are being thoughtful in your methodology, you're putting the effort in that needs to be put in, you're going to get good results. If you're not doing that, you're going to get trash.
Yeah, and I'll add, just to kind of tie it back to both questions. And for the listener is, what you were saying just now, Stefan, where you have these, if it's coming from an organization and it's a public poll, then what you're reading in the article is a narrative that's structured around that poll, right? And everybody on this call is a professional pollster that we also provide narratives to our clients. But those narratives that we're providing are the strategy of how they need to use this information to win on election day. Whereas the narrative you're reading in a public forum is whatever the writer of that article is trying to do, and they're not necessarily trying to give you the best strategic information that was acquired from that data. So the best way to read a poll is to go read the data of the poll, look at it, and look at a whole bunch of them, and then you will kind of get a form, or a more general opinion about what is going on in the electorate. Because the pollsters themselves, the guys that do the ABC poll, the guys that do the New York Times poll, those are legit pollsters. They're getting legit samples. Their data is good. And so if you look at that data and you just kind of piece it together over time, you'll get a good sense of what's going on, because they are able to get the same quality sample that we are. It's just the narrative that it's delivered to you is very different than the way we would deliver that same narrative to our clients, because we have an incentive to give them, non-biased strategic advice.
Two quick things just to add on to it. That one is, if you're asking this from the consumer perspective, how can people be intelligent consumers of this stuff? Is one, don't just accept the narrative. I totally agree with your point. If you can, read the poll yourself.
Yeah.
Because often there's a lot going on in the poll that didn't fit the narrative, maybe because of length, maybe because of other issues. So if people are really interested to know what polling is saying, they should read the polling. The second is, there are a lot of media stories that are based around a focus group. One very prominent outlet in particular that every once in a while will run a story. 12 people said they're angry about whatever. I don't even read those, honestly, because it's completely meaningless in terms of research. You can't, as a methodological issue, just assume that what happened in any one focus group, even the most masterfully conducted focus group, really represents what anybody else thinks. Usually you do focus groups and then you check what you heard in the group in a poll to make sure that it actually represents the broader electorate. So whenever I see a media story that's about a focus group or even multiple focus groups, I literally don't even read them personally, because it's just that those are just set up so that a narrative can be written. That's not actually research. Yes. So maybe I'm a little extreme on it, but I always resent the idea that those are being presented as something that represents a bigger group other than the 12 people who were interviewed. And it really doesn't.
You're not being extreme. You're right. Yeah.
Let me ask about something slightly different than focus groups, but a little different than traditional methodology. We've seen kind of a proliferation of online sort of opt-in samples that have sort of massive sample sizes, but obviously are not even attempted to be representative, at least prior to whatever statistical adjustments are done. How valuable on those? How reliable are them? Are those things you guys just ignore?
Every survey, you have to look at the demographics. Pete jumped right into that area, and we should expand upon that. Go look at the survey. Go look at the demographics. Just think for a moment that when you look at a national survey of voters, although that information is somewhat irrelevant in a presidential race because the electoral colleges and the battleground states will dictate which way this thing goes. But if you're looking at a national survey, do you think that the voters that they interview should be leaning a little bit more Democratic or a little bit more Republican? I can make a case, and I'm a Republican pollster in terms of a pollster that works with Republican candidates, that the nation is about 3 to 4 points more Democratic than Republican. You can look at Gallup samples, which I've had access to, look at state by state, what do they identify themselves, looking at 77,000 voters per year back in 16 and 17. And guess what? 150,000 interviews is a pretty big sample. And the nation came out about 3 points more Democratic than Republican. You want to know a bigger sample? Back at the time, look at the Obama versus Mitt Romney race. Obama won by 4. Look at 16. On the popular vote, Hillary Clinton won by 2. Average 3 points. Drop the Obama Mitt Romney data off and pick up the 2020 election, and it's still about a 3.5 point differential. So when I look at a survey nationwide, that's what we should see. And every state is a little different. Florida has a very, very close to even number of registered Republicans and Democrats. Be careful when you look at a state like Wisconsin and you look at data, and in the polling, they ask, are you registered to vote as a Republican or Democrat or independent? Well, guess what, Alec, you don't vote you don't register by party in Wisconsin. That's a poll that you would have to question.
Yeah, and to Mike's point, right? Like massive shifts just don't happen. It's just not human nature. I mean, it would have to take a earth-shattering dynamic change to move people in like quickly and and meaningfully. So when you're seeing state polls get I mean, there was one a couple of weeks ago that was like Biden's up by 10 in Pennsylvania. No, he's not. Like, he's not. I'm sorry. Like, it's just that is not going to happen, right? So, and if Biden up by 10 in California, sure, absolutely, right? And then also, when you're looking at some of the stories, and a lot of this blame I will shift onto the reporters reporting the stories, because they want clicks, they want a salacious headline, right? So like, and massive swings among, I think one of the big popular ones right now is among Hispanic voters. It's like Hispanic voters are not going from 20 points, Biden 20 points down to Biden 5 points up, back to Trump 15 points up, like week by week. It's like that is just not how anyone like. It's just not how this works, right? So to Mike's bigger point, right? Like there's kind of look at the expectation. Is this massively outside the expectation? There better be a really good reason why, and if not, you're probably looking at analysis and or data that's not totally sound.
Yeah, and the question really on like modalities is, the five of us, we will use modalities other than phones, where the basic assumption that that the randomness can still be upheld. Whereas if you have to opt in or you're become a part of a sample that is continuously polled, right, which is a lot of times how those online surveys are actually conducted, that negates that assumption of the basic assumption of sampling theory that you have this sort of random assignment of the electorate that then you can make these assumptions about and expand them out. So like online polling is very rarely used by people like the five of us and that do internal polling and do those kinds of things. We will use text message polling, like text to web, because you still don't have that necessary opt-in other than picking up a phone call, because that's also an opt-in. The physical action of like going to a website or being allowed to be prompted by a online polling service that has a panel that they've already collected, it's a very different assumption about who those people are and the types of people they are. And so like Alex, I don't know if this will make sense, but like if you have a street, like the Hoteling Downsian street, right? And you have business A and business B. Well, in an economic sense, you can move easily on that street. Well, in a political sense, you can't move easily on that street. The street's tar. And so you just don't move very far between business A and B. So like what Stefan says, so you can't have big shifts. And the assumption used in online polling is that it's the same choice as an economic choice of like clicking on a website. And that's not exactly what accepting a poll is. It's a very different thing. And so using modalities that don't carry that fundamental assumption are problematic.
And to make the point there and come back to your question, Alex, on just what Blake was saying on the online poll, the part of what we have to do to make a poll good is it's random. Online is not random. That is an opt-in. And what we've learned is usually when, we all talk about, a lot of pollsters, after the cycle get together in the room and, talk about practices and whatever not, and just talk about whatever. But one of the things that we have noted that we continue is how do you reach that, less engaged voter? Because the less engaged voter is going to make up a plurality, if not a majority of the electorate. Well, online polling is the reverse. You're basically getting activists and highly engaged voters. So that's why, I'd ask your listeners, when you see polling, it's also very important to read the methodology statement. Because if it's a 100% online, you're going to have really highly engaged voters, which is not representative of the electorate at whole. And you'll probably have like super small undecided percentages. Usually in online surveys, you get about 2-3% on undecided at any given time. And, we're 10 to 15% undecided on election day. So that's just kind of a note on general online is you're going to get a really engaged voter with that type of methodology.
Yeah, and just to put a pin in that to what Pete said, like, sorry, he's right here on my screen. The like, it's almost better to have a focus group because you could randomly sample a focus group, and if you only had 12 people, you can't fix this within the number of people because you could have an online sample of thousands of people, but if they're all hardcore left activists and hardcore right activists and their whole political opinion is their Facebook feed, right? That's a so unrepresentative sample that no matter how big it gets, you can't make any projections on it. Whereas you could have 30 people in a room that you truly randomly sampled, and just picked them up on the street and threw them in your car and say, hey, we're going to ask you some questions. Like, that would be a much better projection of the electorate than a giant N equals 10,000 online sample of all activists.
So one other dynamic on this opt-in issue, right? So the opt-in issue is people sign up for a panel so they can get asked to do surveys. So I share everybody's skepticism of them. I've had, personal experiences with them. At one point I did a race where there were some polls that didn't make any sense, and I realized I could just go sign up and completely make up my demographics, and there was no quality control. So I share everyone's concern about it. But recently, a reporter contacted me about another aspect that I hadn't really considered, which is the prospect that they could be intentionally manipulated by outside actors, like a country or whatever, someone who has resources. And so that's a whole other, it's a little tinfoil hat, but that's actually a legitimate thing because the way the poll aggregators tend to work, at least some of them is, they'll take any poll and put it in the aggregation. And they're really not, like I was looking around before this to try and figure out the answer to, I think, your first question, which is, so how do things really look? And what I saw was there was one poll in particular that was getting reported all over the place. And it was not from a firm that I knew. It was from a firm that said that they're a public relations firm, not a research firm. And every cycle, there's a firm like that does dozens of polls. And so they influence the aggregators. So if you're an opt-in poll, would be a relatively easy way to do it.
And 538 does a good job of eliminating. 538 does a good job of eliminating that. So like all five of us are like on 538 and they give us scores by like how well we do, and then they weight what actually goes into the poll based on like how legit you are as a firm, and then how well you do.
Yeah, it's not all aggregators.
No.
In fact, it was a 538 reporter who brought it up to me.
Yeah, no, I'm asking. Yeah. I'm just saying that for the public so that they know that if you want to look at an aggregator, 538 does a good job of this.
Yeah, well, so let's follow on talking about these aggregators, because I realize you guys are looking at your own internal polls, but the aggregators, at least in principle, have the ability to give you, a larger sample size in the sense that they're implicitly combining a large number of polls. How much do you look at that stuff? Do you think about that at all? Does that give you some check on your own polls?
I don't think it gives us something to check upon. It's just interesting to see. But I go right to the demographics, and I've actually taught classes of go click this tab here, learn more about the poll. Some of these firms get it right, some of the universities get it right, but some don't. One case in point, Fox News back in 2017 had about an average of 7 points more Democrats than Republicans in their polls. And then and they do about the third week of every month, Fox News will do a survey, nationwide survey. And in October of 2017, the Trump job approval fell 3 points. And the headline was, hurricanes diminish Trump job approval. Really? Hurricanes? Okay, that's interesting. Look at the data. That poll, that October survey, was 12 points more Democratic than Republican. Do you think maybe the demographics led to the 3-point differential or drop from the previous month, or was it the hurricanes? And so it gets back to what Blake was saying about the narrative that we sometimes see and disagree with. So I don't know if I don't check against those polls. I find them interesting, and I think the key is one of the takeaways from this today should be everyone go look and see how the survey was conducted. Does it meet you're tested. What do you know about Wisconsin? What do you know about Florida or any other battleground state in terms of how it typically votes? And look at the demographics.
Yeah, and I think that the way that the five of us would use it, and maybe tell me if I'm not speaking correctly for you guys, but the way I use them is, I know I'm a pretty smart guy, but there's a lot of other smart people out there. And so I go read other people's ways of phrasing questions. And that's typically the way we will use it. And then I'll look and see, like, did that phrasing make a difference, right? Or if I have access to data, raw data, like from Chris over there, he sends me his raw data because we use him. And Mike, I've seen his raw data before. I'll take those actual raw data and I will redo my own analysis of it, or I'll roll it in and do like a time series analysis of it. Or recently I built an auto encoder that does like a cross encoding of questions and answer choices, and like I'll test it that way by trying to find emergent properties within that of like the different ways I word questions versus the way Chris words questions, those kinds of things. There's lots of ways to do it. The aggregators, from a public perspective, go and see, if you really care, go look at the way it was worded. Not just so Mike's right. Sample is the first place you look because that's the most obvious way a poll could be wrong. But if somebody asks a question in a really weird way that like isn't the way everybody else was asking it, you might get an entirely different outcome. Because the way you word a question is really important. And, Alex, you know me really well. Like, I'm a super jargony type guy, right? Like my writing is really dense and hard to read. And so I very much have to like put a very different hat on when I'm writing a poll, because I'm like, this is going to go to a lot of people that didn't go to college for 12 years. And they're not going to understand the way I've written this question, or they may just not have the information available to them to understand the policy thing I'm asking about, right? And so I have to word it in such a way where it's easy for them to know, like, that's what my opinion is. That's what my opinion. And if somebody writes a question where it's not obvious to you what your opinion is, disregard that question in that poll, because the likelihood that most people didn't understand that question is true, and that means the opinion that was gathered is stochastic at best. And stochastic means random. Sorry, jargon. My bad.
Yeah.
So some of you have touched already on there not being large swings. There's a broader narrative that political polarization has been increasing and that there are fewer sort of undecided or persuadable voters than there used to be. How much do you see that in what you're doing, and how much is that a challenge?
Yeah, I mean, I won't speak for everyone else, right? But I think 100%, right? And I think one of the most telling graphs of sort of where we are is, now I'm going to forget who put it out, but they mapped how many people were in between the most conservative Democrat and the most liberal Republican. And back in like the early 80s, there was something like 150 members of Congress that fell between that, right? So there have always been, look, these are the hardcore conservative members, here are the hardcore liberals, but the middle was much more mixed, right? And I don't know, what are we're down to like 2 or 3 senators you could say maybe fall into that category, and I don't know, 10 in the House. So the lines are not sort of blurred in that middle anymore when it comes to our politics. So the voters tend to be, I don't know if you want to say the voters are less so, but the choices are less so, right? So then therefore voters are pushed into those more defined boxes, which, I mean, I'm going to say probably makes our jobs technically easier, because you don't have that like switching going on. I mean, I think it's bad for our country, bad for our politics, but so it's a little bit of a chicken and egg, right? Like, is it the voters that have gone that way, or is it sort of our politics that has gone that way and the voters follow. But I don't think well, I don't have an answer exactly for which came first.
Well, Stefan, that's a very much open question in political science. So if we all had an answer to that, we could write a really nice paper that would get a lot of cites. But yeah, to that exact point, like it's a function, right? So there's some function of the like how polarizing voters seem and what they're actually presented with in terms of choices, right? And so if you have a lot of choices in policy outcomes, I don't think voters' opinions have gotten any less or have really changed in such a way where you have a lot of voters actually at the extremes. So the way I think about it is, think about you have some scale where you could put yourself on that scale for every issue. So you have all of these issues where you know where your opinion lies on a scale. And most voters have positions that compete with one another. So they're either aligned with the Republicans on one or they're aligned with the Democrats on another one. And they kind of have these mixed issues. The extreme people that we see on the right and the left are people who don't really have these conflicting opinions on the issues. They're much more coherent in the way they have their opinions viewed, right? And so what we see is that what's being presented to voters is the things that are much more coherent on either end. And so voters then have to decide which issues am I going to elevate and decide on to either be with the right or the left. And so it's not necessarily that they have actually gotten more polarized. It's that it's a function of what they're actually being presented with would make them less persuadable and more polarized. And that's coming from the top now. It used to not, like even 10 years ago, that's not how it was going on. But in the last, since really 2015, that's what we see. And that's so to answer your question, it's more like voters are not any more or less polarized. The ability to persuade them and still win a primary afterwards is impossible.
And on the same note on that, it also depends on the level of race of how many persuadable voters there are. I mean, we're talking about President of the United States, where Biden and Trump both have universal name ID, and 90% of the public has formed an opinion of them, sure. But when you start getting down to the congressional level in an open seat scenario where name IDs of both the Republican candidate and the Democratic candidate are 50, then sure, there are messages and narratives that could potentially sway. So it really depends on the persuadable level of what level of how far down the ballot is it? Because everybody's going to be thinking about the president, and sure, I mean every single survey we've done internally. Or what we've seen publicly in swing areas, Biden's favorability is upside down, and so is Trump's. So a lot of the polarization is basically the public is negative to both candidates. So it feels like it's polarized, and we can argue that all day and long, but it depends on the level of race too. I mean, you will see a lot more persuadable voters from further down the ballot you get. Even in, competitive United States Senate races, the persuadable voter will be persuaded at some point. It's just the timing of when that occurs. That's our job to figure out.
So if you're a consumer and you're trying to figure this out, it might be confusing because you still have a lot of Americans who call themselves independent, and you still have a lot of people who call themselves moderate. And so that seems like they should be persuadable. But in fact, what's happening is exactly what everyone's describing, which is I've seen it with members who have made it up. So it's kind of the opposite of what Stefan's talking about, which is another real phenomena, which is members being more partisan. You also have members who try not to be that way and who try and cross over and struggle with it because politics is so much more tribal, especially in the high-profile federal races. And so people just pick their camps. I mean, I think you even see it in things like your court races. I mean, I'm pretty sure I wasn't involved in it, but I'm pretty sure you experienced that in Wisconsin. I know I've seen it elsewhere, is that these things become much more partisan in terms of people trying to figure out, are you on my side or not? It used to be in the case of a court race, people would gravitate toward candidates who would say, I'm going to call balls and strikes. I'm going to be an impartial judge if I make it to the court. And now it's different because now it's more people trying to signal, I will stand with you. I'm part of your tribe. And so there's a lot less, movement happening in an election like that. And the other thing is we're in a time of extremely emotional politics. In the 90s, you had 10-point plans. Maybe by the time you got to the 2000s, it was 5-point plans. We're really not talking point plans anymore, right? Each side is just bludgeoning each other because politics are so emotional. And where people's conclusions are based on strong emotions, you're going to have a lot less persuasion. So for the internal political polls, you see it because you give people information and then you see whether they change their mind or not. You don't actually see it much in the public polls. Kind of a long way of saying that. So it would be hard for the consumer who's looking at public polls to see that as much, but you see it in the internal strategy polls.
So there's this question following up at that of whether the choices being presented to voters are just more in line with the parties so that we don't get liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats anymore as candidates, and an alternative that it's the voters that are causing that. So I think you were sort of suggesting this is in part from a response to voter behavior that that's not a good strategy anymore. Is that right? How much is this being driven by voters and how much is it being driven by the candidates or parties?
I think if we tag on to what Pete was saying, is that like all politics has become national in a way, right? So you're dealing with this national zeitgeist. Chris actually talks about this a lot when he does polling presentations, is that there's this environmental thing that you have to put up with, and that can turn any campaign into something that is Trump versus Biden all of a sudden. And so like I do some municipal polling for fun, mostly. Not a lot of money in municipal polling, but it's interesting because in Texas they have nonpartisan races in municipals. So and you'll see a lot of people who are conservative and vote for basically Democratic candidates and vice versa in municipal races because it's so close to your home, right? Like I care about there being a pothole on my street, not about national issues like the border or something when we're talking about my city council member. But even then, if something happens, right, like if a city were to talk about CRT or something like that, right, then all of a sudden it becomes a national thing, and then everybody's in their national tribal camp. And so it's almost like the voters have decided what their national camp is, and that's not necessarily their camp writ large. It's just the easiest one to attach themselves to because it's the one that's in the media, it's the one on Twitter, it's the one on Facebook. And if they're in a situation where that zeitgeist doesn't enter the race, then it's very much back to normal. But as soon as that enters the race, then we're in our tribes.
And this is a typical blame the media game. I mean, the media wants to put up, interview, put on the air the hard right and the hard left. I mean, you just don't see a whole lot of moderate Democrats, moderate Republicans who are elected get a lot of airtime. They like that. It's clicks, it's views, it's everything. So you're just going. Unfortunately, when you were asking Alex, is this the voter thing? Is the party thing? It's a little bit of both. It also doesn't help that this is who's thrown in their face. Our side of the aisle hard right, their side of the aisle hard left. That's who they're seeing. So they think, well, everybody's like that. That doesn't help. Let somebody else take that too.
Yeah, and then you also, and again, it's always you can kind of blame a little bit of everything, right? So it's like, look, so people tend to move closer to people with their own sort of similar background, similar ideology, things like that. It's not universal, but that's where people tend to gravitate towards. And then you also have, on top of that, you have politicians who, whenever possible, would love a district that they don't have to put much effort into winning, because no one actually, or not many people really enjoy actually running. They just want the job. So So we have districts that are not overly competitive, and federal level, it's happening in a lot of states, depending on the systems that they have in place, right? So now you have a combination of, well, if people, on the one hand, are sort of gravitating towards people who have similar ideologies, and we're now drawing lines in a way that make sure that people have to do the least work possible. Everything kind of comes together. And we did a little experiment. This is like 6 years ago now, where we said, what would it take to actually get the most competitive races humanly possible? And the gerrymandering it would take in most states to get, like in Wisconsin, I think it would. I mean, the lines were insane to get, something close to a fifth, like as many competitive seats as humanly possible based on past elections. So there's, some of it is sort of manufactured, but some of it also is like, it's just the way that things are moving in a way that it's really hard to make a perfect balance. Hey, let's get, 70% of these districts as competitive, and then we'll have a more sane politics, is something that's just not going to happen.
Right.
One of the things to look at is it was touched upon by Blake and others is the environment, and I call it maybe a little differently, the political landscape. And when we grew up in an era, I grew up in an era where we had 3 TV stations or broadcast, ABC, NBC, CBS, and you put an ad on the air and you covered those 3, everyone saw the ad. Now it's not that way. And tracking advertising of our candidates turned out to be a lot different in the most recent election cycle than it was in the past. And being able to cut through, we say it's hard to cut through the clutter when everyone's got ads up. Now you can have streaming with commercial supported. You could have non-commercial supported streaming. More people are getting their main TV programming from those than from traditional sources. It was just about 12 years ago we had cable versus satellite as a way of breaking out television. How do you get your signal? And now it's all over the place. Case in point, Greg Abbott spent tens of millions of dollars more to get reelected in Texas and won by 11 points than did the Attorney General race, Ken Paxton. He won by 9, and he spent barely anything. And here's one spending over $50 million, winning by 11. Here's one spending $2 million and winning by 9. And so now that political landscape, what's going on in the election cycle, which will be nationalized this time, means so much more for the down ballot candidates.
So how much is it in the control of the candidates how nationalized the election is? Is this a strategy that candidates can and do use, at least if they're the candidate whose advantage it works to try to make it a nationalized election when it's a local one?
They have to they have to hire one of us 5 and do a survey and find out what they should be saying. That would be the quick answer. It depends. It depends. If I'm running for state rep and I have certain characteristics and issues that I find are important in the way I communicate them with the voters, particularly the independent voters in a toss-up district, then yeah, I'm going to talk about those things. I control everything I say about myself as a candidate. I control everything I choose to say about my opponent, called the Leesburg grid that we all learned. Opponent controls everything he or she says about themselves, and everything they choose to say about me as the opponent. So do I choose to say things that I believe in, that I want to do in office next, my record, or do I choose to say some things about my opponent or some combination thereof? Versus, do I fall under the umbrella of a nationalized campaign, talking about some of the national issues? It may or may not make sense. Congressional, Senate, maybe more so because they're federal races. But it still depends. I've seen local campaigns jump all over national issues.
My take on it is it's an important decision that every campaign has to make. If you look at the Senate, before I was actually saying that it's hard for a consumer to figure out whether or not there's a lot of persuadability. But one way to look at it would be if you just compare the polls in something like a U.S. Senate race and then the presidential race in the same state to see whether or not there's actually a gap. Because what happens in most of the races, and this has been increasing over the last 15, 20 years, is that the races converge. They're basically parliamentary. You vote the same way for president as you do for Senate. And so you have to figure out how to break through for the most part. But so I always think that you basically, as a federal, this is especially an issue in a federal campaign, because the tendency for all the federal forces to conflate is a natural one. So I always think you have three choices, and you have to figure out how to navigate the three options. One is you can go with nationalizing, because in some places it'll benefit you. So let's say you're a Democrat running in a state where Biden's going to win. You might say, I'm going to nationalize it so that way I can ride on Biden's coattails. That happens. Done that. Second would be you personalize it. You try and make it a contest between the two candidates and their personal characteristics. And I think some of the most successful candidates on both sides have done a really good job at developing an individual persona. So they, pick some characteristics and make sure the public understands them. So you can vote for he or she as a person rather than the party. And the other is you grab onto local or state issues, and you try and make your campaign about the local or state issues. Final thing is just the issue with nationalization, I believe, is if you go down that road and you decide you're going to nationalize your race, I think it's very hard to undo that.
Right.
Yeah.
So once you get on that road, you're on that road to the end of your campaign. So.
Yeah. And sometimes it can be successful, and sometimes it's just the headwinds are just too strong, right? So we used to work with a candidate who used to represent Southeast Ohio in the state Senate, and in 2012 he outperformed Obama by, I think it was like 7 points, 8 points, something like that, and then he ended up winning with like 53% in a district that Democrats weren't typically winning in, and then he outperformed Clinton in 2016 by 15 points and still lost. So it's just sometimes it's like, look, you can separate it, but sometimes it's just those headwinds are just too strong. But to Pete's point, right? Like this is going to be a case by case basis. So if you're running in Wisconsin, I apologize to every voter in Wisconsin for what you're going to have to deal with over the next 5 to 6 months. But it's very hard to get a unique message out there that's not tied into the national, just because every single piece of airwave that you can buy is going to be covered in something that's nationalized. But if you're running in my home state of Massachusetts, there's not going to be a presidential ad anywhere in the state. So now you have an opportunity to make it more local, make it a non-national race, much easier than you could in a state like Wisconsin.
So a lot of the media coverage of polls is about sort of the horse race, right? Who's ahead in the election. But if I'm a candidate and, employing one of you, what's the most important thing I can get out of the polling? Is it that horse race and how I'm doing in the race, or is it something else?
That is the least important. On an internal poll, we all say it, but the candidates never follow through because that's what they also want to talk about. But the horse race is the least interesting question in that entire survey for an internal poll. We spend way too much time talking about it, even internally. But everything else is what's much more telling and much more interesting.
Yeah, that question only becomes the most interesting question if you run that as a tracking poll on the day before the election. Then it becomes the most interesting question. But other than that.
So what is the most interesting question for a candidate?
It varies. It's going to vary, like we were talking about, from district to district to state. But I mean, broadly, the most value that a candidate gets out of their internal is understanding what's on the voters' minds and what needs to be communicated to them, whether to persuade them or whether to hold them in their camp. That's actually, you guys may have some different opinion, but that's the most value that a candidate running for office gets. It's like, okay, right now we are here, and usually it's like tons of undecideds. Where do we need to go? We need to get here. And what is it that I need to be saying? What is it that we as a campaign need to build a narrative around? What do I need to be saying, and where are my pressure points on my opponent? So it's more of the value of the messaging piece of what to say, how to get to the finish line versus the horse race.
Yeah. Alex, you asked what candidates find interesting. They do find the horse race numbers very interesting, and we have to get them to turn their focus to the messaging that Chris was talking about, and get them to latch onto that. In a way, we're likens ourselves to assistant football coaches up in the booth calling down plays. Do we really care What play scores a touchdown? I'd run off tackle all day if it got me 8 yards a pop. Does it have to be a Philly special? Some trick play? No, we just want to win the game. And so we find out the messages that help our clients, our candidates advance that ball down the field. They don't always listen. Many do. But there's something we have to keep in mind that while we figure out what works pretty much in black and white, or telling information over the phone and getting an answer back, or if it's text to web, they get to read the questions themselves. Somebody's got to get creative with this information and turn it into an ad, turn it into a little 10-second ad, even on the web. It's got to turn it into a direct mail piece. So in a way, as difficult as polling is, and we say, oh, we have to do more dialing, and it costs more now this year than ever before. Our job is really relatively easier than the surgeons on the team who have to take this information and do something with it, because we can find out really good information to communicate, and then it gets lost in translation.
So
as
on the
Mike's
public
agent,
polls,
I'm just going to disagree real quickly as Mike's agent that we have the most difficult job and therefore should be paid more money than anyone else on the campaign. All right, Pete, you were saying?
obviously. So for the public polls, I mean, I agree with what Chris was saying. So for anyone who doesn't know any of this pollster stuff, so usually there's a question that's along the lines of what is the most important problem facing the community that you want the candidate for whatever office you're talking about to address. So some version of that. So that tells you what is top of mind for voters. What's the thing? Now, sometimes there's a dominant answer, sometimes there is not. And it's easy to misinterpret those. So ideally, you'll also have some information about how that question got answered by Democrats, Republicans, Independents, among other things. Because, for instance, if the top thing is immigration, but if you look within the poll and you see it's all the Republicans who are answering that, but it wasn't the Independents or the Democrats, that's very different than if the Independents also say that it's their top concern. But I agree, like that's a really important one to know, just what concerns are the voters bringing to this conversation. The second one, though, if I could choose what I was going to get from a public poll, is the one that I would really like to have is also either job ratings for specific things like handling the economy or immigration or fentanyl or whatever the issues du jour are, or comparative attributes on this issue. Who do you think would do a better job, one candidate or the other? Because ultimately, that's what the voters have to figure out is, am I going to choose this one or that one to deal with the thing that is really bugging me? So if that's in a public poll, I would read that.
Yeah, because to Pete's point, in our internal polls, we can do fancier methods to kind of distill that, right, from the messages and whatnot. But a lot of times the number one issue or the most important issue that's top of mind isn't the one that we're going to message on the most, right? And it's not the one that's most effective, because that issue is the one that's top of mind is so baked in already to everything that's going on. So it's not the most interesting one. But if you're only looking at a public poll, the comparisons kind of get at that distillation through message regression that we do internally, of like what on different issues, what people are actually thinking a candidate is better or worse on. And that will give you how the sort of the relative power of those issues rather than the top issue.
So how much of a danger is it for candidates to appear too poll driven, and how much is that appearance even related to the reality?
Depends on what you mean by poll driven. I would say this. I mean, when we test messages, and this is again internal, not the public side. We're not trying to change candidate A's view on something. We're just trying to find the things that you believe in what work. So it depends on what you mean by poll driven. Now, if I will tell you, the biggest flaw is if a candidate is out reading the papers and reading Twitter and seeing all these polls come out, and that's poll driven. Again, I go back to what I said at the beginning. You never make strategic decisions on polls you didn't pay for. So that would be a problem if you've got, which has happened, where you have a candidate looking at, every Washington Post and USA Today and Wall Street Journal poll out there and saying, we got to do this, get this based on that. That would be a problem. But in the internal side, we as pollsters don't tell them how to believe. We just find out what about them or our opponents are the most useful to persuade the electorate.
You should hear the accusation in the public, though, that candidates are determining their position or changing their position based on the polls.
Yeah, but they don't walk around with these binders, right? And say, "Hey, I'm kind of poll driven here, right? I got these polls, and they don't wear them on their chest or on their shoulders. They have to be more natural in what they communicate, and they have to show that some empathy. They have to show that they care, and they truly want to be an agent of change, because voters are looking for what are you going to do for me next when they go vote for you. The future is more important than the past, and so I don't think there's much of a concern about them appearing too poll driven. If anything, from where we come from, it's can we get them to get on a message and stay on a message?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think most of the time, yeah. Go ahead, Pete. Sorry.
Just as a pollster, though, I always cringe if I hear a candidate say, "Well, what people in my community want."
Yeah, that's where I was going.
Yeah.
Yeah. Normally, when somebody is accused of being poll driven, what they're actually being driven by is anecdotes and not poll tested, just random sample methodology messages, right? Like those are very different than usually it's. If they're like, oh, you're being poll driven. No, they're being driven by anecdotes and narratives that are in the public that they think are useful that we probably never tested.
Right. And I mean, because like ultimately at the end of the day, we're trying to help sell a product, which is a candidate, and we're trying to sell it to a set of consumers. And just like, any product, what we're trying to figure out is how do we connect what we have with what they want? And, and so to Chris's point, like, I'm sort of guessing none of us have ever told someone what to think or told a candidate what to think, but it's like, okay, here are the 5 things you care about. And 2 of those the voters care about. So why don't we focus on those 2 things? Because that's where the match is versus please don't talk about this thing because no one cares, even though you do. That's great. Talk about that, with your significant other at the end of the day. But like, there's no real reason to bring that up in front of voters.
Now, to flip it on its head, though, I think there's also a real problem with candidates who don't believe in polling. So, like, Lincoln talked about the importance of public opinion a lot. In fact, we put them all over our website for that reason, because for exactly the reason that you're talking about, which is there's this caricature of the pollster as this Svengali who manipulates people into being phonies and saying magic words and talking points and so forth. I don't think any of us want to work for someone like that, really. What you want to do normally is to work with someone who has strong beliefs and convictions and a great story and great abilities, and then help them do what everyone's talking about, which is how do you just distill it into a message that connects? So Lincoln would go out and give speeches because he knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to preserve the Union, but he would go out and give speeches and then change his pitch a little bit based on the kind of reception he was getting. So he knew the goal, he would get feedback, and then he would change it. I think he, who knows? I believe he actually would have read polls. Because they're a useful way to achieve his goals, not a way to figure out what should I say to bamboozle people, but how do I get people behind me so I can achieve my public policy ends.
Right. And I think, and now I'm going to totally get on the pollster soapbox here, but I mean, what we do or what polls do, right, is so critically important to like a functioning democracy in that like we're presenting information of what the residents of this country think. And if you just dismiss polls completely and say they're garbage and just ignore it, what you get is the loudest voices. And, Chris or Mike made the point earlier, right? Like if you're just listening to the edges, it's a disaster, right? And so, the importance of providing that feedback of like, hey, this is what people like, this is what people think, this is what they want. Now, it's up to the elected officials of what they do with that information, but that information should absolutely be front and center in the conversation.
So I want to end by shifting gears a little bit and asking you for your predictions about November, not necessarily in terms of who's going to win, but in terms of like what issues are going to be driving the election, what are the dynamics of the election, whether it's president or Congress or state elections that are going to be driving the elections this November, and what should people be looking for in following the election?
When it comes to an issue side, I mean, the main, you could look at a few issues. I think the issue right now of immigration border security is very heightened. It moved from a big issue that was Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Southern California to now a national issue. So I've been seeing that pick up a lot of steam, not just, along the border, but, Oregon to Maine and everywhere in between. So there's that issue. The jobs and the economy is always going to be an issue. And I do believe that, especially my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, will make women's rights, abortion rights an issue. It will come back up. Those are the three that I see kind of as the most right now. There will be others, but there's the Chris Perkins tape. What do you guys?
Cost of living is an important one too. About a year and a half ago, we would split sample test cost of living with inflation. Inflation's kind of flattened out. The cost of living is still high. And to the degree candidates talk about that will be interesting, and what it is that they have plans to put more money in your pocket. After all, it was Bill Clinton in '92 who said it's the economy, stupid, or his campaign did. So it does come back to the economy. But I think more specifically, Chris, it's this concern over the cost of living.
Yes, I agree with you.
Well, I'm comfortable in predicting that in November, roughly half the country is going to be disappointed in the outcome. I'll stand by that prediction. And I think, I mean, if I'm going to take my most pessimistic view of this, I'm going to agree with Chris that I think this is going to be immigration versus abortion rights, and other issues are going to have a tough time bubbling in. But 6 months is a lifetime in politics, so we'll see where we end up.
Yeah, well, let me add in that being that I have a business degree before I got into this, I learned in accounting that balance sheets measure assets and liabilities and net worth. Well, that's what a poll does. It measures attitudes at a given point in time. And so where things stand now will be different, like Stefan says, from where they're going to be on election eve. The best predictions we can make, and the best predictions I ever made, when I am lucky enough to have a client that will not only poll through Thursday before the election, but through Sunday or Monday before the election, because they get hooked on the data like some kind of crack cocaine or something. They can't get enough, and they just want to buy more and more and more and more, and that's fine. That's fine. They can't do anything with the data strategically on Monday morning or Tuesday because all the media is bought. But that's when we make the best predictions, because we have, at the end of the quarter, so to speak, or at the end of the month, we have data right up until that point.
Yeah, all of us are really, really good if we can do a poll the night before. Like,
oh yeah,
we don't miss by much. My prediction is, pretty much the pessimistic view that if everything becomes national, it's going to be some form of border mixed with cost of living, because inflation doesn't seem to be going down for, household items and that kind of stuff. So the tying of those two pieces together is probably the main thing for the right. And then on the left, it's going to be abortion. It's going to be sort of a full-blown crisis of society is what they're going to try to push, is that there's a crisis in our society, and one is the left's view of it, and one of them is the right's view of it. And that, I don't know how persuasive either of those two things are really outside of Trump versus Biden. So if you go down the ballot, it's going to get a little bit more clunky. Places where immigration is super important, that's going to dominate. And we'll see what happens from there. I will agree with Stefan, though, that half the country is probably going to be disappointed in November.
So I can't predict. I can just give you what I hope will happen, because I actually agree with my Republican colleagues here that the economy is vitally important to have as part of the discussion. And I think if the Democrats decide to engage on that and have a real fight over the economic consequences, then I think we'll be in a much better position than we probably are today, because I don't think that's really happened effectively so far. I particularly even think of the Haley voters that are out there, who I assume would be very responsive to that kind of thing. Not necessarily a message about raising taxes on wealthy people, but just an economic message that gave people some reassurance. So no prediction, but my hope would be that writ large the Democrats decide to engage in that one, because I think Democrats have a substantial advantage when it comes to abortion rights. And I think we can have a very effective fight with the other side when it comes to the economic issues if we choose to engage on it in the kinds of terms that voters bring to that conversation. So not about fairness necessarily, not about going after rich people necessarily, but how do you just address the concerns that people have in their daily lives, like the cost of living concerns? Mm-hmm. As far as prediction goes, no idea. Although I don't disagree with these major issues.
All right. Well, Blake,
I actually do have a prediction, like on a precinct level in the entire country for the outcome, but you got to pay me money for that. So.
All right. Blake, Chris, Mike, Pete, Stefan, thank you all for taking the time to do this. I wish we could keep talking all afternoon, but I think this has been a fun and illuminating conversation.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks,
Thank
Alex.
you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yep.